Welcome to the 75th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest Rabbi Reuven Chaim Klein to the show.
Thank you, Rabbi Drew. How are you?
My pleasure. I'm good. Rabbi Klein here, for those less familiar with him, aside from being from the LA Valley. And where'd you get smicha from?
My first smicha is from Rabbi Moshe Sternbach and Rabbi Lerner, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Lerner. And I have other subsequent smichas from Rabbi Zalman Nechemia Goldberg and from a dayan in Beit Shemesh known as Rabbi Chanoch Sanhedrai.
Cool. Awesome. All right. So we got that. In addition, Rabbi Klein here has written numerous essays and also has two published books. The first of which was Lashon HaKodesh, History, Holiness, and Hebrew. And the second, and this is a lot more relevant to our conversation, is called God versus Gods, Judaism and the Age of Idolatry. Can you talk to us a little bit about the God versus Gods book and what it's about?
So basically, my book, God versus Gods, is broken up into two parts. The first part follows the narrative of the Bible, of Tanakh, and it goes through all the stories that are relevant to discussions about the struggle against idolatry. It talks about like Adam, it talks about the Tower of Babel, it talks about Abraham, all these things as it connects to the fight against idolatry. It summarizes the book of Judges and the Jews in the desert and the kings. So I took all these different stories and put them in perspective using a lot of traditional sources and a little bit of archaeology and some scholarship to put together a better understanding of what's going on. And then the second half is a sort of encyclopedia of the different types of deities and idolatrous gods that appear in the Bible by name, explaining what they were, who worshipped them, when they worshipped them, how they worshipped them, etc.
Wow. That's really awesome. It's so complete like that. Before we get into the Midrash, I just want to set as a little bit of a background. We have this set of these verses here at the very outset of chapter 25 in the book of Numbers. Israel was staying at Shittim. The people profaned themselves by whoring with the Moabite women. And they invited the people, they invited the people to the sacrifices for their God. The people partook of them and then worshiped that God. And thus Israel attached itself to Baal Peor, and the Lord was certainly not happy. He was incensed with Israel. So we have this where if you really think about it, it's just a quick connection of the profaning, the women, and sacrifices, and then worship. That's a really quick way of putting it. The rabbis got a little creative. They sought to do some rabbinic narrative expansion with Midrash. So we have this Midrash. Now, it actually turns out that it appears in a little bit of a different version in different places throughout rabbinic literature. So the first one is in Sifrei Bamidbar. They came and sat in Shittim. So this is from that first verse in Numbers 25. So they came and sat in Shittim in the place of straying, which is a nice play on, not just taking the name as it appears in the Tanakh and in the Bible, in the Torah, but playing around with it, trying to derive some further meaning. So at the time, now this is interesting, Ammonites and Moabites arose and built markets for themselves from Beth Hashimot until Har Shelik. What's really interesting to me, I'm just going to pause, which is we see what's going on in the book of Numbers. It's actually the Moabites and the Midianites that oftentimes pair up with each other. Here in the Midrash, they're throwing in the Ammonites, which is a curious piece. Here they set up women. In the translation here it says harlots, but it just says women in the Hebrew, and they sold different types of spices. Okay, and so Israel would eat and drink. That's great. Israel ate and drank. Nothing wrong with drinking. At that time, someone would go out for leisure, and they just wanted to buy something from the elderly woman, and she would sell it at whatever price, right? But then there would be a younger one who would then call out to this guy, "Hey, from inside, come, I can sell it to you more cheaply," and he would then buy it from her. So that was the first thing.
Because what Jew could resist a cheaper price, right?
Or anybody, but especially Jews, right? Hey, it's really nice the woman out on the outside, the elderly lady, is selling for a great price, just like how it should be selling. But yeah, come on inside, you can get it cheaper. And then he keeps doing this on the first day, on the second day, on the third day. This lady on the inside, the younger one, says, "Come on, you can choose for yourself, right? You don't have to just stick with those options. If aren't you? You're a Ben Bite. You're just like someone of this house, right?" So he'd go in, and there would be a setting, just a side next to her, there'd be this pitcher full of Ammonite wine. Now, I'm gonna pause. It's just so fascinating that it talks about an Ammonite wine here, especially since in the later appearances in the different Talmuds and elsewhere, it doesn't ever mention that the Ammonites were involved with this ploy, whatever these machinations are. It's always Moabites, right? It's fascinating that they're throwing the Ammonites in here and Ammonite wine for whatever reason. But so it was full of this Ammonite wine, and there's this totally extraneous, absolutely unnecessary comment, which is since Gentile wine had not yet been forbidden to Jews, which is just a fascinating comment because this is taking place in biblical times, and Gentile wine wasn't forbidden until the first century of the Common Era. It was like, I don't know who would be able to be confused by this anywhere close in time to each other. I don't know about you. It's a seemingly extraneous comment about the wine piece, but all right. So then she says to him, hey, do you want to drink wine? He's like, of course. Like, who wants to turn down wine? Drinking's great. So he would drink, and then the wine would sort of inflame him. Like he would get, I don't know.
Intoxicated?
Yeah, but also like I want to say sexually empowered. I don't, something like that, or like he then demanded of her, like he got
the Hebrew word is boer, which boer is usually used like for like a fire that burns. It talks about Yaakov with the sheep, and it says when the sheep were in heat. So it's talking about like becoming heated or getting heated up.
Yeah. So he's becoming heated, which is a nice language. Really, it's like he's becoming aggressive, right? He gets excited. Like the wine's making him not only this inflamed, but like an aggressive in a sexual manner. And he says, hey, listen to me. he's not trying to make her understand something when he's saying, listen to me. It's more of like, heed my demands. I want to do something sexual. So she would then take out, this is really strange, this defus, an image of Peor from underneath her breastband and say to him, my master, is it your will that I should listen to you? And obviously he's in a mood that he wants her to listen to his demands. So then she says, you need to bow down to this. You need to prostrate yourself to this. And he says, what? Why would I prostrate to idolatry? That's not me. And then she says to him, what else is there? Like, what is it? What difference does it make to you? And just bear yourself before it. And then from here, they said, sages rule that bearing oneself to poor is its mode of worship. The wine would burn within him again. And he said, listen to me. And she says, do you want me to listen to you? And then if you want me to consent to you, veer off from the Torah of Moses. And he did so, as is written. They veered off to shame and they became detestable. So in the end, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So
as they say in Seinfeld, yada, yada, yada.
Exactly. So it was, here's what I find. I mean, we can go back and I am actually curious to talk about some of the variants in each of the Talmuds, especially the Talmud Yerushalmi has a very interesting addition or two, which I definitely want to get to. For me, what's really fascinating about this Midrash is it's sort of in a broad macro sense is what, like the sages were bothered. Like, what do you mean? Like, how were they just had sex with these Moabite women and like that was enough for them to worship? What was sort of like, what was the catalyst for getting this whole thing going? Oh, wine. First of all, it was initiated through commerce. Marketplaces are a totally neutral site. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, there's a familiarity. Okay, well, familiarity, okay, but familiarity itself isn't enough to necessarily make someone go and worship idolatry. Oh, but there was also wine involved. Wine, okay. And again, it's not even the wine that's even sufficient enough to initiate these things as a catalyst. It's also then you need the next step. The wine then leads to the sexual aspect. Oh, there's something in it for them. And then they're seeing this continuum of it's as another step to get to the idolatrous worship and then that's where it ends up. I don't know about you, like as far as what triggers the Midrash, I think it's an interesting move on, the Midrashic minds of the rabbis to make that happen, right?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of different things going on over here in this midrash.
I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I wanted to break in and give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Rabbi Noah Farrow on a really interesting drinking story called Kamsa versus Bar Kamsa.
That's the important part for our purposes.
Right. I'll give you money for whatever I eat and drink. So he's eating and drinking.
Drinking. Drinking's the most important part of the story.
Right?
We wouldn't be here
with my tea.
Drinking in the story.
I hope you enjoyed that episode featuring Rabbi Noah Farrow coming out next week. I hope you come back and watch or listen to that. And now back to our episode with Rabbi Klein.
The first question you would ask is like, what's going on with the wine over here?
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, if you think about it, I think the rabbis looked at wine as a sort of double-edged sword. Drinking wine is something that's like ubiquitous to Jewish practice. We drink wine by Kiddush, Havdalah, on Yom Tov, at a bris milah, at a wedding. They used to drink wine when they were in mourning. It's an important tool in Jewish rituals, but then there's also sort of a danger of using wine in an improper way.
Well, it's a social lubricant. It's a social lubricant. It makes people more open to
it loosens people up. And I once wrote an essay comparing the study of Torah to wine. The rabbis compared the study of Torah to wine. It says in Psalms, it says, "Yain samach levav enosh." Wine makes happy the heart of a man, makes glad the heart of a man. And it says about studying Torah, "Pekudei Hashem yisharim mesamchei lev." The God's statutes are yisharim, are straight, and they make the gladden the heart. You could say that the rabbis tell us that studying Torah, if you do it in the proper way, it can be a samachayim, it could be an elixir of life. But if a person studies Torah with improper intentions and with improper goals and objectives, it could be a samamavis, it could be sort of poison. The same thing could be true of drinking wine. It depends on the context, it depends on a person's intentions. So I think that it's definitely true that one dimension of this midrash is that it's sort of a social critique against the recreational use of wine that's devoid of any religious or sort of higher purpose. If it's just doing it for the fun of it.
Do you think that's a possible aspect of this midrash as a critique of that?
I do think so, because I think that the rabbis looked at the Roman carnivals and they saw what happens at the Roman carnivals, where the pagans would get drunk and do all kinds of things that are reminiscent of this midrash, and they're trying to teach in an exhortative way. Try to limit it and try to stay away from that. I think that could be one aspect.
Do you actually think that? By the way?
Yeah.
Really?
For sure. Yeah.
I mean, you look. Looking throughout rabbinic literature, wine pops up all the time. They're just sitting around drinking wine. They have wine a lot. Even at a mourning house, they're just drinking a bunch of wine. So it's clearly they're having wine often, right? It's just part of their lives.
True. That's true.
Right. You have a beit mishteh. It's a drinking house. They're just getting together and drinking, right? Drinking happens all the time in rabbinic literature.
Right, but it still could also lead to inappropriate things, and the rabbis are still warning about that.
That's part of life.
I don't know. I also think that the way the rabbis looked at the Baal Peor cult, so the idea of Baal Peor, sort of the worship of Baal Peor, where you either defecate in front of the idol, or at least you expose yourself in front of this idol. So it sort of rejects the boundaries of human decency, and it gives worshipers the freedom to do whatever they feel like doing. So I think that sometimes people could use wine as sort of an excuse to escape their responsibility and do whatever they feel like doing. Like, I'm drunk, so why are you doing that? Oh, I'm doing that because I'm not really there. I'm sort of out of it, so so it's okay.
To me, this doesn't feel like so much of this midrash doesn't feel like so much of a critique of leisurely wine consumption, in as much as it is as far as part of the slippery slope of how did it get to be that these Jews were engaged both in the harlotry with the Moabite women as well as eventually worshiping Baal Peor. I think it's more of this operates as a social lubricant to get them two things: A, to make it easier, but also more importantly as a sexual device, really. To help inflame them, as it were.
Yeah, no, I hear that also. I think that's definitely also another motif that's present in the Midrash, and I think that's also one of the main themes that it's trying to relay. I mean that really feeds into sort of what I'm saying, that it's like the inappropriate use of wine as opposed to the appropriate uses.
Well, the funny thing is, it's not even clear if this is even an inappropriate use of wine. I think that's one of the fascinating. I'll say this: it's a fascinating ambiguity out of this midrash. It's super duper unclear.
Okay. There's a lot of points over here, and I mean, even in the biblical narrative, there's a lot of points that are unclear. Like you were mentioning before, when you look at the passage that you read from the beginning of Numbers 25, so it says, the nation strayed towards the daughters of Moab, right? But then if you go further in the story, so it talks about Zimri fornicating with a lady named Cosby, the daughter of Tsur, who was the prince of Midian. So yeah. Who were these Jewish men with? The Moabites or the Midianites? And then if you go a few chapters later in Parshas Matos, so then Hashem in Parshas Pinchas, Hashem tells them to go wage battle against the Midianites, and avenge the Jews' honor for having done this sin with Midianites. Then now it sounds like it was Midianites, not Moabites. There's a lot of like.
So I think my take is, first of all, it does talk in the book of Numbers about Moabites and Midianites sort of getting together, saying, "Hey, we have a Jew problem, right? We have the Bnei Israel who are a threat to us. Let's pair up." I think the way I read at least the beginning of chapter 25 here in Numbers is that the Moabites were the more dominant, more numerous here, and the Midianites were just sort of, a fewer in number, let's say, right? That's my guess.
So the approach that I tend to favor to understanding this topic or this sugya in the Bible, it follows the Barbanel. The Barbanel has a very interesting approach where he disagrees with what you said. He says that it can't be that the Moabites were actually the dominant players in this story, because I mean, first of all, the revenge is against the Midianites. The lady who was with Zimri was a Midianite, and furthermore, he says that when the Torah says that there's a prohibition in Deuteronomy for a Moabite man or a Moabite woman to marry into the Jewish congregation. So the Barbanel points out that when the Torah gives that prohibition, it gives the reasons for it. One reason is because they didn't bring out bread and wine for you, bread and water for you when you were traversing through their territory, and one reason was because they hired Bilam. Now, the Barbanel argues if the Moabite women were so instrumental in causing the Jews to stray, the Jewish men to stray, then why wouldn't the Torah mention that as one of the reasons to ban the Moabites? And furthermore, our tradition tells us that female Moabites and female Ammonites are permitted to marry into the Jewish congregation. It's only the males. But if it was the female Moabites that were so instrumental in causing these men to sin with the Baal Pa'ar, so then for sure the females should be prohibited. So the Barbanel says that it wasn't really the Moabite women. So why does the Torah say that they began to stray with the Moabite women? So he says that really it was just Midianite women, but get this.
Okay.
Get this, it gets better. It gets better. Barbanel says that the Midianite women disguised themselves as Moabites in order to conceal their actions so that they're not going to give the Midianite nation a bad name. And so when the Jews were straying with these women, the Jews thought that they were Moabites. So when it says that they strayed with Moabite women, it was talking about from the Jews' perspective. But actually, it was Midianite women, and the truth came out later. And when God told them to get their revenge, it was against the Midianites, not against the Moabites.
It's clever. I don't buy it.
That's the Barbanel's approach.
I know. It's clever. It's clever. I don't buy it, but it's clever. It's amusing. Yeah. But I think they teamed up. Moabite, Midianite. Yeah, it is a funny thing, but they definitely are in cahoots, the Moabites and the Midianites here in the book of Numbers.
I mean, we do see it, but with Bilam, they were working together, and
Right.
it wasn't. It's not. Yeah, the Barbanel is a little bit of a stretch, but he does raise some points that really have to be addressed.
Yeah.
So you asked when you were reading it.
Yeah.
Where do the Ammonites come in? Right. The Ammonites are not mentioned anywhere in the biblical narrative. They don't come up anywhere in the whole story.
Right. So there's that, and also in the other later appearances of this Midrash in the Talmuds and elsewhere, the Ammonites are not part of it, of the Midrash. Right. So that's an interesting, like, why did they pop up? And also, since we're talking about Ammonites, and what about the wine? Why specifically Ammonite wine, not Midianite wine or Moabite wine? Like, why Ammonite wine?
Right. So I looked into this a little bit, and it came out with 4 different approaches that we could think about why it says Ammonite wine.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so the first approach that I came out with is based on an article I wrote in the Jewish Bible Quarterly entitled "Between the Rivers Arnon and Jabbok" back in 2016. So in that article, I discussed the contradiction in biblical sources about the territory between the rivers Arnon and Jabbok. Jabbok appears in next week's parsha, actually, when Jacob crosses the Jabbok brook. But in Parshas Chukas, in the Torah, in Numbers, it seems evident that the territory between Arnon and Jabbok belongs to the kingdom of Moab. And yet, in the book of Judges, in Judges chapter 11, so there was a judge named Yiftach, and the prophet relate over there that the king of Ammon demanded from Yiftach this area of between Arnon and Jabbok, and he claimed that, this historically belonged to my nation, so you have to give it back to me. And the Jews at that point had conquered it, and he said, I want you to give this back to me. Now, the problem is that if you look in the Torah, it seems like that area belonged to Moab, not to Ammon. So why is the king of Ammon demanding that area? I wrote this article in the Jewish Bible Quarterly back in 2016 that addresses this question. I discussed several different answers, but the relevant answer to our discussion is the idea that Ammon and Moab are actually like one nation, and they only sort of separated maybe at a later point in history. Maybe they would switch off which one would be the more dominant one, but more or less Ammon and Moab, Ammon and Moab are the progenitors of Ammon and Moab. Their namesakes were sons of Lot, who were brothers, right? And their mothers were sisters as well. So Ammon and Moab are like, sort of brother nations.
It's right here, right? This is your article.
The one. That very good.
Yep. All right.
Yeah, it's available for free online. There's a lot of different points, where you see the convergence of Ammon and Moab as one nation. Going back to that story in the book of Judges. So in Numbers, you see that the name of the god or the deity that the Moabites worshipped was Chemosh. And elsewhere in the Bible, you see that the name of the god that the Ammonites worshipped was Milcom. And when Yiftach speaks to the king of Ammon, so he refers to Chemosh, your god. But Chemosh wasn't the god of Ammon. Chemosh was the god of Moab, not the god of Ammon. So this sort of points to Ammon and Moab being sort of like one nation. The Nachmanides actually makes this point also in his commentary on the Song of the Sea, the Shirat Hayam in Exodus. So over there, the Song of the Sea goes to how the different nations reacted to the great miracle of God splitting the sea, and it lists all the different nations how they reacted. And one of the things it says is Ele Moab, Yechazemo Road, the strong men of Moab, Road, a shaking had took hold over them. Right? And it talks about Plishtim, what the Plishtim were scared, all these different nations were scared. And it talks about Moab being scared, but it doesn't mention anything about Ammon. So Nachmanides over there in Exodus says that it doesn't mention Ammon explicitly in the text because Ammon was included with Moab. When it says Ele Moab Yachazem Orad, so that also includes Ammon. So if Ammon and Moab were sort of like one nation, one territory, if you want to go with, even if you're not saying that like a Barbanel that it was Midianites pretending to be Moabites, let's say it really was Moabites, we could understand a little bit why it would make sense that they can have Ammonite wine because they're sort of like one nation. It doesn't explain why specifically Ammonite wine over Moabite wine, but it does explain how the Ammonites really come into the picture.
Yeah.
So that's what do you think about that explanation?
It's an interesting one. I'm not as familiar with like all the confusingness of Moabite and Ammonite territory and gods. That's why I'm relying on you here. So I guess it's plausible. I just don't know, it makes me also, by the way, once you started mentioning their gods, I'm also curious to hear a little bit more about Baal Peor. Is this the only time the Baal Peor pops up, or is it other times?
Baal Peor only pops up over here in this story, and then it's mentioned again in the book of Yeshua, but it's referring back to this story.
So this is it. This is
it, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Hey, I hope you've been enjoying this episode with Rabbi Klein so far. I wanted to break in and ask, do you have any ideas, suggestions? Maybe it's topics for the show. Maybe it's speakers for the show. Maybe it's something that has nothing to do with the show, but are potential resources that Jewish drinking can offer. So if you do have any ideas, please reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. And thank you. And now back into our episode with Rabbi Klein.
So this is one explanation of why Ammonite wine as opposed to any other nation's wine.
Mm-hmm.
Another idea I was thinking, this is more sort of exegetical. This isn't really so much literally understand what's going on. Even as if my first explanation was more literal, right? But
I like literal.
Oh, you like literal.
I do.
This one is a little bit even more abstract. If you take a few steps back and you're looking at, the origins of Ammon and Moab, right? Going back to Lot escaping the destruction of Sodom, and he's out there in the cave with his daughters.
Yeah.
So from Lot's perspective, there's something very funny over here. That the first night comes, his wife, his daughter, his eldest daughter gets him drunk and sleeps with him. Right? Okay, fine. Now comes along the second night, and his second daughter offers him, here's a cup of wine. She gave him wine, right? So she offers him a cup of wine and says, come drink. Now, what motivates him to do it again? He knew what happened last night, right? He doesn't learn his lesson from there.
He must not have been too hungover that day.
Yeah, or hanged over.
Hungover, yeah. I know if I'm hungover, it's hard to drink that next day. Unless it's a light hangover. It's possible.
So why does Lot agree to it? He doesn't learn his lesson.
He likes the wine. He had a good time the first night.
He had a good time, right?
Yeah.
So I think that over here the Midrash is maybe alluding to an idea that you can say that the way the Midrash presents it, it doesn't sound like it happened to one person. Oh, there was one Jewish guy who ended up drinking Ammonite wine and he ended up sleeping with some Midianite or Moabite woman, right?
Right. That was just like that was happening.
This was like some ongoing story, right?
Yep.
But I think that once it happened the first time, then everyone should have learned their lesson from it and made sure not to drink it, right? They should have been more aware and more mindful of what's going on.
They probably didn't care that much. And they were having a good enough time.
Oh, so that the problem is that they didn't learn the lesson. They didn't care, right?
Right.
So I think,
and also it could have been could have been going on in private, and people might not have been telling other people, right? So it could have just happened in a widespread fashion, but it wasn't a huge problem because people didn't know because they didn't tell anybody else.
No, that could be. That also could be. But I'm saying that maybe the use of the term Ammonite is sort of context clue that hints to this lesson of you should have learned your lesson from last night, so why are you drinking it again? That led to the birth of Ammon from Lot. So maybe here too, it's sort of Midrash is criticizing the people that didn't learn their lesson from the first guy that it happened to, and they're not being as wary of it. Right? Maybe that's the presence of the name Ammonite, sort of to highlight this message. I don't know. I did find there's a Rabbi David Cohen in Flatbush, the rabbi of Gvul Yabetz. So he has a sefer called Id de Zutter. He actually asks this question. He says, where does it come from? Ammonite. Why Ammonite? Why not Moabite? If we're talking about Moabites and Midianites, so where do Ammonites come in? So he actually had a very interesting idea. He wants to say sort of the opposite of what I was saying in the beginning. He says that there's a sort. He said that he understands that there was a sort of sibling rivalry between the Ammonites and the Moabites, and they didn't really get along with each other.
Okay.
And so he wanted to say that maybe each one would call would sort of, they have something called slut shaming. And they would try to say that you guys you have loose morals, you guys sleep around with everybody or whatever. Mm-hmm. So maybe the aphrodisiac wine that one nation had, they would call it after the name of the other nation. The Moabites called their aphrodisiac wine, they called it Ammonite wine, and the Ammonites called it Moabite wine. It's sort of like
really
the Americans.
Brilliant. I like it.
It's sort of like the Americans call the coronavirus the Chinese virus.
Right.
The Chinese call it the American virus. It's sort of like feeding into that rivalry.
I unusually buy that. I actually think that's really clever. As far as the Midrash goes. Yeah. Right, and it's also interesting because we never see we don't see the Moabites and the Ammonites working together here in the Book of Numbers. It's the Moabites with Midianites, so it's clearly except for this Midrash where you do have the Moabites and the Ammonites, collaborating according to this in the Sifrei.
The truth is that throughout Numbers, throughout the whole Torah, except for in Deuteronomy when there's a prohibition about Ammonites and Moabites, you never see any mention of the Ammonites as a separate nation, which really in the whole Numbers it doesn't mention anything about Ammonites.
Wow.
And like we said in Exodus, they're not mentioned over there in the Song of the Sea. So that also that really points to what I was saying before, that they were really one nation and they sort of splintered off maybe at a later point in history.
Interesting.
Fourth thing that I saw, the Yad David. You're familiar with the Sefer Yad David, Rabbi David Zinsheim?
I am now.
He was the head of Napoleon's Sanhedrin.
Okay.
If you Google him, there's a picture of him with this really cool hat that looks like a camel. But Rabbi David Zinsheim and Yad David and the Margolius Hayam, so Rabbi Reuven Margolius in Sechel Sanhedrin, so they bring down that I don't quite understand why this should be true, and they themselves disagree with this assertion, but they say that somehow the term Yayin Ammoni implies that it was actually Yayin Nesach. It was actually wine that was used for Avodah Zarah. That's why the Midrash uses specifically the term Yayin Ammoni, because it's trying to say that this was wine that was really bad, really seriously forbidden. I don't know where they see it. They themselves say that they go with a different explanation. They don't follow that.
So I don't like it. That having been said, here's one possible backup to them. So this is how it appears in the Talmud Yerushalmi, that it does actually call it. They say Mala Yain mean Hayain Hamoni Shehu Kasha Vehu V'Dayin Lo Nesar Yainan Yain Nesech Shel Necharim. So basically, in the Yerushalmi, it does say that Yain Nesech had not yet been prohibited. So maybe they're basing their read on the Talmud Yerushalmi.
That could be.
I'm just trying to provide a defense for their opinion.
No, that could be. We'll get to the discussion about the different decrees and when the decrees came into effect. But the consensus definitely of the Rishonim, at least of the earlier sages, seems to be that wine that was actually poured for Avodah Zarah is forbidden by biblical law, by the Torah.
Yes. Yep.
So it's not that's not a rabbinic decree. So it's
right.
Very hard to say. There are Rishonim that say that the actual Yayin Nesach is an Isser D'Rabbanan, is a rabbinic prohibition. I have a list of the Meiri in Avodah Zarah seems to say that. There's a Tosos in Yevamis that goes in that direction. So there do seem to be sources that go in that direction, but that's not necessarily the consensus. So it's interesting that Yerushalmi says Yayin Nesach. It doesn't say Stam Yainam.
Right.
Although it could be sort of a polemic. It's calling Stam Yainam Yayin Nesach as a way of making it sound more serious than it is. Yeah. You wanted to talk about other aspects of the Yerushalmi.
So there's this really cool aspect that it actually says here's what's going on with this Ammonite wine. So it says that Ammonite wine is very strong, and that's why it's not regular wine. It's Ammonite wine. It's stronger, and also that it serves as an aphrodisiac. It's it's an aphrodisiac to the body, and its scent was enticing, which I am so fascinating, because that actually, according to the Yerushalmi, what was different? What was special about this Ammonite wine? Well, it was an aphrodisiac wine. It was stronger, meaning like they might have been used to drinking regular wine, non-Ammonite wine, and here it just overtook them, right? I know that when people drink something of a higher alcohol content, it hits them harder than what maybe they're used to drinking.
Yeah.
Thoughts? I thought this was really cool, the Yerushalmi about the Ammonite wine.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the connection is actually even deeper than that. Do you know where the word aphrodisiac comes from?
I don't. I will now.
You will now, because I'm also consider myself a linguist, so and an etymologist. These are one of the things that I'm interested in. The word aphrodisiac actually is related to Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, what's interesting is that there's a connection over here. The way Avodah Zarah works is that a lot of different idolatrous cults have gods or deities that are sort of the equivalents of each other. In different areas, they call it a different name, but it's sort of the same idea. So you have like Aphrodite is the goddess of love in the Greek pantheon, but then when it comes to the Roman pantheon, it's more or less the same thing, but they call it Venus. Right? Then when it comes to the Canaanite pantheon, it was called Ashtoreth. Okay. And when it comes to the Babylonian pantheon, it was called Ishtar or Istar. Like Esther is possibly named after Ishtar. Without getting into all the details, it has to do with Venus and Ayelet HaShachar and a lot of different connections over there.
Cool.
I guess you'll have to read my book to get all the connections. But the point is that so aphrodisiac comes from Aphrodite, which is related to Ishtar, Ashtoreth, etc. And what they say is that the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia, that the Muslims revere in Mecca, the big black rock that they do hakafas around, right? So, so the Kaaba, according to archaeologists and other anthropologists and scholars, is actually an ancient site of worship of Aphrodite / Ishtar / Ashtoreth. It was a sort of fertility or love goddess shrine, basically, before Islam came into existence and it became a quasi monotheistic site. Okay, so the Kaaba is related to Aphrodite, Ishtar, Ashtoreth. Now, there is an old Jewish tradition, about 1,000-year-old, at least can be documented 1,000 years ago. The first place I found this is in Sikta Zutrasa, where it says that the Kaaba was actually the worship of Chemosh, the Moabite god Chemosh.
Okay.
Which is very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, it gets even weirder because archaeologists found in Jordan an inscription called the Mesha stele. And if you read the Mesha stele, in the Mesha stele, it connects Ashtoreth with Chemosh as well. So it's like a circle. All these things go back to each other. Ashtoreth, which is related to Aphrodite, which has to do with love and fertility, right? Which is related to the word aphrodisiac, is related to Chemosh, which was the god that the Moabites worship. I don't know what any of this has to do with Baal Pa'ar. I mean, if they were idolaters, they were probably polytheistic. So then they might have been worshiping multiple gods. So maybe they were worshiping Baal Pa'ar alongside Ashtoreth and or Chemosh. I don't know exactly how all these different things jive, but we don't really know what Baal Pa'ar was, anyways. Chemosh is something that's attested to in archaeological record. We have names of Moabite kings that they called themselves like Chemosh Melech or things like that. But we don't have, Pa'ar doesn't really come up. And I talk about in my book different suggestions of what Baal Pa'ar could have been. They want to identify it with the Greek god Priapus or other different obscene Greek and Roman gods, but it's not really so clear. Well, I mean, the connection of Ammonite wine being an aphrodisiac, and relating back to Moab and Midian it runs deeper than just there's a Midrash that happens to mention Ammonite wine. I was thinking of another hint to where wine comes up into this whole story. As you mentioned earlier, that we don't see anywhere in the biblical text itself. It doesn't say anything about wine or drinking. So, like, where does wine come in? Like, where did the rabbis get this idea that wine had anything to do with the story? So, I think that we can say like this: if you look in Deuteronomy, when it talks, this is complete conjecture, but I think it's an interesting point. And I think you'll like this one actually.
I'm open. I'm here
because it's simple. It's like literal. It's literal.
Yeah.
It's in Deuteronomy when the Torah prohibits an Ammonite or a Moabite marrying into the Jewish people, so it says because they didn't greet you with lechem v'mayim, they didn't greet you with bread and water, and also because they hired Bilam. So if you don't want to say that Ammon and Moab is like one nation, right? So there's two different nations and there's two different reasons. If you want to maintain some sort of parallelism, you would say one reason applies to one nation and the other reason applies to the other nation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hiring Bilam clearly belongs to Moab because it was the king of Moab, Balak, the king of Moab. He's the one who hired Bilam. So it must be that the other reason that they didn't offer you bread and water when you were traveling through their land, that must be applying to the nation of Ammon, right?
Hmm.
So Ammon is banned because they didn't show their hospitality by bringing you bread and water. So now I have a question. Yeah, like you said before, drinking wine was ubiquitous in the ancient world. Everyone was drinking wine. That was an everyday occurrence, right? So why does the Torah say, because they didn't bring you bread and water? Why doesn't it say bread and wine? Bread and wine always go together. Like they said, Yain yisamach levav enosh, lechem levav enosh yisad. Wine gladdens the heart.
You can even go earlier in the Torah when Melchizedek brings out bread and wine to Abraham.
Melchizedek brings out bread and wine, or by Pesel Micha in the book of Judges, it says that the gam lechem the gam yain yeshli, but the hospitality of Micha's shrine, they offer bread and they also offer wine. When Abigail, also in the book of Samuel, when Abigail brought provisions to King David, or to the future King David, so he was already the king then. Yeah. When Abigail brought provisions to King David, so she gave him bread and wine, and bread and wine are the special foods. They get their own bracha. Right? There's no other foods that get their own special blessing. Bread and wine. So bread and wine goes together.
Right. It's from the sixth chapter of Mishnah Brachot.
Yeah. So that's Mishnah Brachot exactly. In the sixth
chapter,
the first Mishnah. Why is it that the problem with the Ammonites is that they didn't bring you bread and water? It should be that they didn't bring you bread and wine. So I was thinking that maybe the wording in that prohibition is saying that you don't want their wine. Trust me. It's like saying no, what you would have expected from them for their hospitality is bread and water. But bread and wine, no, you don't trust me. You don't want their wine. So wine wasn't something that we were criticizing them for not giving us.
I mean, I think bread and water is like a bare minimum, and then wine is,
I mean, in the ancient world, people drink wine as if it was water. It was like.
Yeah, Rabbi Klein, thank you so much. This was quite insightful. It gave me definitely new ways to perceive this midrash, new insights, and hopefully for the viewers and listeners out there, you also got something. So, Rabbi Klein, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi Drew. It's been a pleasure being on your show, and maybe I'll come back one time. We could talk about other stuff also.
That'd be really fantastic. And l'chaim.
L'chaim to you too.
L'chaim. All right.